Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1, where we continue looking at Paul's experience in a Roman prison through the Philippian letter, and his statement how Christ being his life's purpose changed everything for him. We have been looking at this little remarkable letter and attempt to answer the question, how, essentially, is what I've been trying to do anyway for you. How can the Apostle Paul, who's found himself in these deadly serious circumstances, be feeling so much pure joy? And then, of course, by extension, how can I have the same experience? Whether what I need is joy or peace or patience or love or whatever it is that I need. And we have seen the short answer already. The difference in our experience in Paul's is that, for the most part, most of us, unlike Paul, was entirely sold out to Christ. Entirely sold out to Christ. Total commitment with nothing of himself reserved. In fact, Paul summed up the secret, really, of his experience in verse 21, remember, of chapter 1. To me, he said, living is Christ. Jesus is not just part of my life, he is life itself to me in every conceivable way. And that is why he's experienced what he did. And while that alone would probably have a great impact on the way you go through life, it actually does something more important for us, because it positioned Paul, and will in turn position any believer, to allow God to supernaturally produce the characteristics we want to see in our life. Remember, this isn't philosophy. This isn't where Paul decided, here's what I'm going to do. I love God. I'm just have a positive outlook, and no matter how bad things get, I'm just going to choose to be happy. This wasn't a philosophy that was working for Paul. In fact, that wouldn't have worked. What was happening is God was supernaturally producing joy in his life because Paul was completely yielded to Jesus. And that's the only way that it works. It's fruit, not philosophy. But just because the results are supernatural doesn't mean we can't trace why this works. Now, last week we saw one aspect of this. When Christ is your life's purpose, it changes your earthly concerns. We looked at Paul's concerns in his situation, and they weren't the typical concerns you would expect. Here's a man who's alone, in prison, with no way to be helped. And he expected that at some point he was going to be executed, possibly. And in that situation, he wasn't depressed, he wasn't miserable, he wasn't protesting his innocence, he wasn't trying to escape. In fact, he ended up saying, I really don't care whether I die or not. In fact, if I do die, that's fantastic, because then I get to go be with Christ. And he didn't have any of the same concerns that we might have in that situation. That's because when Christ is your life's purpose, what you're concerned about is going to change. Most of us go through life with a list of concerns that are entirely tied to this world and to our own well-being, and that's why our way doesn't work for us most of the time. So we kind of, unfortunately, sort of plod along, and was it Shakespeare that said we kind of live Christian lives of quiet desperation, hoping that maybe someday something will change. To sum up last week, I had three sort of thoughts, and we'll hit them again before we move on to what we're going to look at today. When Christ alone is your reason for living, it will change your earthly concerns. And when your concerns change, the way you view your circumstances are going to change. And when the way you view your circumstances change, your emotional and spiritual response to those circumstances is going to be vastly different. That's why it works. Again, it still must be supernaturally produced. And only total commitment to Christ is going to produce that. So let's now move on. Living as Christ will not only change your earthly concerns, it will also change your entire approach to how you live your life. That is, it's going to change the choices you make. And that's what we're going to see today at the end of this passage we've been in. When Christ is your purpose, not only will it change your concerns, it's also going to change your life's choices. And that too will result in very different spiritual and emotional outcomes. First of all, let's look at Paul's dilemma. We're going to start our text in verse 22 today. He has made his great statement already in verse 21, for to me to live is Christ and die is gain. We've covered that. It's a great deal. At least touched on it probably every week. But look at what he says beginning in verse 22. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet what I shall choose I cannot tell, for I'm hard pressed between two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. As we open our text today, we see that Paul has a dilemma. He's caught between two good things. He is caught between his own desire, which we already know what that is. What does Paul want? He wants to die so he can be with Jesus. He's caught between his own desire and the needs of others. And remember, Paul's concerns from prison is that the gospel be preached, that the people around the situation understand that he's there because of Christ, that he wants to glorify Christ no matter what happens. Paul isn't concerned with living or dying or any of those other sorts of things, even changing his situation. But you can certainly see how when Paul says in verse 21, to die is gain. To die is gain. When you consider what he's going through, you can see how death might be preferable to his situation. It's no wonder he says in verse 23, I have a desire to depart. Here's one of the things I want you to understand about Paul. He really did want to die. He wanted to die. That word desire that we see there, epithemia, means I long for something, I lust for something, I covet it. We usually think of it in negative terms, but it doesn't have to be used that way. Paul said, I covet death. I lust for it. I can't wait to be with Christ. And what I want you to understand is Paul didn't feel that way because of his circumstances. He didn't want death because of what he was facing. He says why he wanted to die. Look in verse 23. Because to be with Jesus is much better. Is far better. We already know how Paul feels about his situation. It doesn't matter to him. He's not depressed. And so this idea of I want to go be with Christ isn't some kind of, oh my word, just let me die, be done with this. It's not what was going on. He's actually filled with joy. But he does really want to die because he wants to be with Jesus. That's what he wants more than anything. But there's a bit of a problem. And that appears in verse 24. He says, nevertheless, to remain in the flesh with you is more needful. It's more necessary. It's important for you that I don't die. What Paul's saying here, there are other things to consider besides what I want. Because what I want is to go be with Jesus. But when I stop and think about the whole thing, I understand that you might need me more than I need to go be with him. You see his dilemma? The thing Paul most longed for versus the thing they most needed. What Paul wants is to depart and be with Christ, but what they need is for him to stay and continue to serve. And I hope that you can see the positives in both of those things. Right? This isn't a decision between a good choice and a bad choice. Both of these things are good stuff. On one hand, if he stays, look at what he says in verse 22. Well, I'll just get more fruit. I'll just work more and then I'll have more fruit. So if I stay, that's a positive. He says in verse 24, it's more needful for you if I stay. He says in verse 25, if I stay, you guys will end up rejoicing. So he says on one hand, if I stay, there's all this good stuff. I'll just keep working for Christ. I'll get more fruit. You'll have what you need and you'll have joy because nothing happened to me on one hand. But on the other hand, he says in verse 23, I get to depart and be with Christ, which I love how he says is far better. Both of these are good things. These are both legitimate things. but it's Paul's desire for what he wants versus what the Philippians need. And that's put him in a very difficult position. Look at what he says in verse 24. Verse 22. He says, yet what I shall choose I cannot tell. What I shall choose I cannot tell. This is not mere sentiment. Paul is genuinely torn here. In fact, some of the other translations will say, I'm torn. I'm torn. He is describing this dilemma. In fact, when he gets to verse 23, he doubles down on what a struggle it is. He says, look, I am hard pressed between these two choices. I'm hard pressed. Hard pressed. That is the Greek word syneko, and it describes a state of being caught between two things that are pressing in on you so tightly that they're kind of forcing you to go one way. Anyone ever been caught up in a large crowd, maybe leaving an Astros game or something, trying to get through the gate on opening night of the fair, right? And you just sort of, you get crushed in on, and you're just, right? It's happening to you. That's a great way to express what Paul is saying there. He's saying that I am sort of caught in between two very good things, and I think what's going to end up happening to me is I'm just going to be carried toward one or the other. But what I want is to go be with Christ. Paul is trying to describe here for us the extreme pressure that he's feeling, being caught between two legitimately noble things. What he wants to go be with Christ is very good. What they need for him to stay is also very good. Paul's difficulty wasn't between, living in this world and going to heaven. There's no comparison between those two. Paul's difficulty was between either serving Christ in this world or enjoying him in another world. So I want to labor to point out that his dilemma wasn't some kind of a temptation. It wasn't a choice between two evil things, but between two good things, either living for Christ or being with Christ. Now, let's make a bit of application and move on and see what happens. While I doubt any of us will ever face a dilemma, quite like Paul is describing here, I would be willing to bet every one of us have things that we want, right or wrong. We have things that we want. And sometimes those desires are so strong, it feels like you're being paralyzed to the point of having no idea what to do. What are you supposed to do in times like that? Well, if Christ is life, you only have one choice. And Paul's going to show you how to make it. Let's move on to verse 25 and look at what he determined. How would Paul, if given the choice, decide what to do here? He wants to die and go be with Jesus, but the Philippians probably need him to stay. Now, here's one of the things I want you to remember. It's actually not up to Paul, right? He's in a Roman prison. And Jesus, he's already said in the previous verses, is going to do with me whatever he wants to do, and I'm okay with that. So Paul understands it's not like he's making a decision, and that's what's going to happen. He's sort of pondering where he is. And in doing so, he's showing us what to do, whether you realize it or not. How, if Paul could do whatever he wanted to do in this situation, what would he decide to do? Well, he tells us beginning in verse 25. He says, and so being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy of faith, so that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. What in the world does he mean by that? He says, first of all, being confident of this. Here's what Paul means. He says, having had a lot of time to sit here and pray and think and read and pray and think and read and pray and think, he said, I have become persuaded. I'm starting to think along the lines. I am becoming convinced that of my two possible outcomes. To stay here is more important. Okay? He's not saying he's going to, and I'm going to touch on this in a minute. He's sort of thinking through out loud what he's going through. Okay? And what he says is, I have become convinced that while I really, really want to go be with Christ, it's probably more necessary that I stay here for your sake. And then he goes on to say, I know, in verse 25, I know, that is, I perceive, that because of this, I will remain and continue with you instead. Now let's talk about what Paul's saying here, because what it sounds like he's saying is, don't worry guys, I'm going to get out of prison. And that's kind of what he's saying, but not exactly. What he's saying is, having weighed the options that are before me spiritually, going to be with Christ, which is that's the one I want. That's what I want more than anything. That's what I hope happens. I've come to realize that what would be better is if Christ didn't take me. And if he let me out of here and I had more time with you guys, that would be, while I really, really want to go be with him, that would probably be better. That would probably be better. Now, you might be asking the question, okay, what happened to him? Well, the truth is we don't know. Truth is we don't know. Church tradition and some Bible scholars believe Paul was actually released from this imprisonment. And we don't have any of this in the Bible. I'm just giving you some extra here, right? I'll give it to you for the same price I got it, in fact, so you can't do that, right? Church tradition and some Bible scholars tell us Paul was actually released from this imprisonment, and then he went to Spain and did some missionary work, and then he got rearrested and brought to Rome again, put in a second prison, which was much harsher, and he ended up being killed. There's a lot of good evidence for that, and maybe that's what happened. But the evidence doesn't absolutely conclude that beyond any shadow of a doubt. Okay? And I don't want to go into that anymore. So what happened to Paul? Well, we don't know. I mean, we know that ultimately he was martyred. He had his head removed for the sake of Christ, which probably pleased him to no end, right, based on what we're reading here. My point is this. We don't actually know what happened to Paul, but we know what's being said here. And that's the part you need to latch on to. Okay, because it doesn't ultimately matter to us what happened to Paul. We'll ask him eventually, right? But we know what he's saying. And that's what's important for us. And here's what he's saying. I'm going to try to put it in simpler terms, right? His thoughts, his feelings in his own words. When I look at my situation, Paul is saying, I really, really, really want to go be with Jesus, and I hope that's how this goes. But ultimately, what you need is more important than what I want. That's the point of today's lesson. That's how it works. Okay? That's how it works. Paul would say, my continuation on this earth is more desirable for your welfare, despite what it means for me. Let's imagine for a second what happened if Paul stays. Well, he kind of says in verse 25 and 26, he says, if I stay, I'll continue with you, and you guys will progress in the faith. In verse 25, you'll have joy in the faith. And then when I finally show up in Philippi again, you're going to rejoice with great joy because I've come to see you. So if I stay, what does it mean for you guys? Good things. You're going to get to hear more about Jesus. You're going to get to grow in your faith. You're going to get to be happy that everything worked out. That's what you get if I stay. Now, what do you think Paul's going to get if he stays? Pretty good deal for the Philippians. But what about for Paul? Well, what has he gotten so far in his life? in exchange for what he does for the churches. Beatings, imprisonments, false accusations, starvation, hunted, chased, storms, right? All this brutal. And there's no reason to believe that if I get out of this jail and come help you guys some more, things are going to change for me. This is kind of a one-sided deal, right? If what I do is stay, you get all the good stuff and I get more of the same. It's important to understand that despite what he knew was going to happen, if he stayed, if Paul's allowed to live, he's going to get out of jail and he's going to go see the Philippians, and he knows what's coming. More of the same. And in the face of that, you know what Paul says in our verses here? Despite what it's going to cost me to stay, I choose you. I would way rather go be with Christ. It's so much better. But what you need is more important than what I want. I understand that Paul didn't know what was actually going to happen. But I want you to see how that makes this determination more beautiful. Paul is giving up, at least emotionally. He doesn't really know whether he's going to get out of prison. He's speculating. And in doing so, Paul is giving up what he most desires, to endure more of the same mistreatment he's always had, just so that the Philippians would benefit. And let me say this. This is what life begins to look like when Christ is your life. Every choice that you begin to make is going to be made with only one perspective in mind. And here it is. What can I do here in order to abandon me, exalt him, and bless him? When Christ is your life's choices become much easier. The same way your life's concerns last week became much easier. Because it narrows your focus down to what? Jesus, others, you. Jesus, others, you. You start looking at life from the perspective of, it doesn't matter what I want. What do I have to do here to cause me to decrease, him to increase, and them to benefit? And you start living your life that way. What Paul wanted above all things was to die and be with Christ. But what Paul chose is a great example of what it means when he says Christ is life. If I could, I choose to stay so that I can serve and bless others. Christ came to die in order to love and serve others. Paul had to live in order to do the same. And this is what it looks like when Christ is life. From person to person, the choices will be different, right? The dilemmas will be different. The situations will be different. The circumstances will be different. But the outcome will be the same. Christ over everything else, even what I want the most. That's what he's teaching us in this internal dialogue that he's writing down for the Philippians. Now, let's get finished here. Let me explain the takeaways, right? The only reason this is going to work, just like I tried to do last week, there's a reason this works. Even though it'll be God that produces it supernaturally, there's a reason only this will work. Here's what they need. Here's what they are. Until Christ becomes your purpose, until Jesus alone becomes your purpose, what you're going to do is continue to make life choices based primarily only on your personal desires. Even if they're good, I'm not saying they're evil desires, right? Paul said, I lust to die, I covet death. It wasn't evil to feel that way. He had two good choices. But until Christ alone becomes your purpose, you know what you're going to do in the same situation? You're going to choose what you want over what others need. And let me sort of go beyond that, because that's not always going to be the only two choices, right? Until Christ alone becomes your purpose, you are still going to only always choose whatever you desire over whatever other outcome exists. Does that make any sense at all? Until Christ alone is your purpose for living, your choices will continue to be based mostly on what you want. Second thing is, until Christ alone becomes your purpose, you will continue making decisions that primarily benefit only you. Even if the benefits are good. I'm not knocking that just in general. Okay? Paul's desire to go be with Christ was a good desire. And if that's what had happened, well, good. That's a good outcome. But I want you to sort of see what's at the heart of what's going on here. Even if what you desire is a good thing, and even if the benefit is a good benefit, if you're only living your life in such a way as you choose you, Christ is not having the impact you need him to have it. And so here's what happens. I eventually come along to a set of choices, and I just do what I've always done, and then all of a sudden I'm in trouble, and I need peace, and I need joy, and I need strength, and I need all this. And it's not there. Why? Because let's go back to the beginning, where you picked you. Because Christ wasn't your purpose, you were. Third thing, as long as you do so, right, continue to live that way, your experience will continue to be sort of the antithesis of everything Christ would have produced in you. Does that make any sense? If you continue to look at your life's purpose as primarily being you, or me for that matter, right? You know, I'm preaching to the choir. I hope I'd say you. I don't think it's all one way. As long as my life's purpose is still only me, I can only expect to continue to experience what I've always gotten from that. Does that make any sense? I hear this. I'm about to share a quote with you. You've probably heard it before. And I hear it, I think it was attributed to Albert Einstein. Maybe so, maybe not, right? It says, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over and think you're going to get a different result. Well, that's a wonderful truth, succinctly put, isn't it? And so that absolutely applies here. If what you think you're going to do is just keep on living for self, and someday something's going to change, what makes you think that? It's always only ever come out one way. It's not going to be different till you do something different. Till your purpose is different. The reason you're choosing what you're choosing is different. The reason your concerns are what they are is different. That's why I'm telling you only this will work. Only total commitment to Christ is going to make you into what you hear exists and want to be. It's the only thing that can do it, because it's spiritually produced by God in you. It's not something you do to yourself. And He's not going to do it until the sort of terms are met, right? It's fruit. It's fruit. And I think all of us understand the concept of fruit. None of you are going to go pick a tomato in June that didn't plant one in March and take care of in April and May. Does that make sense? You go mow the grass, you don't have to do anything to get that. You're not going to pick any fruit in June that you didn't plant in March and take care of in April and May. That's exactly what's going on. The changes that I think it's safe to say we would probably all love to see, right, in our lives and our lives, only come as a result of us determining, you know what, I'm done. Christ is my purpose. And I'm just going to let God do whatever that means. But Christ has got to start being my purpose instead of me. And then the fruit will come. And so, the reason this works so far, we'll see another one next week. It's twofold. Lord's will. I don't know what happens next week. But so far, when Christ is your life's purpose, It changes your earthly concerns, and that changes how you feel about things. And number two, when Christ is your life's purpose, it changes the way you choose to approach everything in your life. That also changes all of the outcomes. So if you want to end up feeling and experiencing the things Paul felt and experienced in this situation, in your own situation, you're going to have to do it the way Paul did it. You're going to have to live verse 21. To live as Christ, to die as gain. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll be